Live? Are we live? Okay, we're live. We're live on the simulcast. I last one I did, part 9, I think is the last one I did. This is part 10. It was like a week ago, and I realized I'd let the time slip by. I had promised to do a discussion of feminist analysis, patriarchy. The Nome King, I think, is a great example to look at in terms of patriarchy in the Oz series. Certainly, as I've talked about before, this is the 10th time I've done this, but if you're just joining us for the first time, L. Frank Baum had a lot of interest in feminist analysis. His mother-in-law was a significant figure in first wave feminism, Matilda Jocelyn Gage. So he had a lot of interest in that as a topic. He created Dorothy and Ozma and a lot of other characters as role models, as these positive female role model characters, and was pretty strict and adamant about making them strong role models. Not always consistent, he's not perfect at that, throughout the whole series. However, that was his intention. So a lot of articles that you read about series are feminist articles. But the role of patriarchy, there's probably two really prominent figures you can look at. I have Bo's tail in my face. I just lost viewers when I mentioned patriarchy. There's two really prominent figures you can look at as the prime patriarchal characters. There's a lot of them, but there's two really prime characters to look at. The wizard, obviously, who keeps his control of the Emerald City through trickery, through manipulation of the public, through, puts green glasses on people to make them think it's an Emerald City. He has all these machines to create illusions. So he's creating this illusion of power. So if you talk about patriarchy, a lot of what you're talking about is the illusion of power based on manipulation of perception and manipulation of this false hierarchy and stuff like that. For the whole series, that's the wizard really just in part 1, but for the whole series, really the most significant patriarchal character is the Nome King, spelled Nome. I don't know why he spelled it differently, and he didn't put the G on the front. But the Nome King is the patriarchal character who shows up 7 or 8 books. I don't remember exactly how many he shows up in. He's a much more significant villain for the whole series than any of the witches. I mean, the Wicked Witch of the West has become an iconic villain. But the Nome King is, if you read the series as a whole, the Nome King is the most prominent villain by far. He shows up in what was originally meant to be the climax of the series in a book called Emerald City of Oz, where he gathers a whole army of evil characters to invade Oz. That's probably his the evil act, but he keeps showing up, a couple different times. But he really shows up for the first time in Ozma of Oz, the book we're doing the deep dive for. That's where he shows up really. For the first time, the first 2 books really feature female witches much more prominently. The Wicked Witches in book 1, and Mombi in book 2. Also, there's Ginger. The other villain in book 2 is Ginger. So as much as Baum had the intention to, this is why anytime you talk about Baum and feminism, you got to, mention. My dog is barking or something. My dog is probably barking at my cockatiel. He does that sometimes. But anytime you talk about Baum and feminism, a lot of what you kind of always have to talk about is his intentions more so than his execution. And a lot of that comes from, especially in the first 2 books, where he does have these positive role models of Dorothy in book 1, Ozma in book 2. But oftentimes that's sort of counterbalanced by negative imagery. In my Oz class, we always talk about Mad Woman in the Attic. There's your basic standard analysis of negative female stereotypes as a manifestation of patriarchal insecurities. The idea that powerful women are dangerous, deformed in some way, that sort of thing. So Mad Woman in the Attic talks a lot about that. And Baum has that in book 1 and book 2. Baum has that to a degree in book 3 with Princess Langwidere. Princess Langwidere really, she shows up for about 2 chapters, but in the entire 14-book series, 2 chapters of this one, see previous episodes, but in the entire 14-book series, Princess Langwidere is really the last of the Mad Woman in the Attic type of powerful woman turned into vicious, evil, beastly sort of character. But he does have that in the first 3 books to a decreasing degree. I mean, it sort of tapers off book by book. Book 1, you have the 2 wicked witches. Book 2, you really just have Mombi and you have Ginger. Ginger's not a wicked witch. Ginger has that sort of complicated version of the monster stereotype. Mad Woman in the Attic talks about the monster stereotype. The whole idea of powerful women manifesting as these monsters. Ginger doesn't quite fit that. I mean, she has, she is technically the villain, but she doesn't quite fit that monster stereotype. Mombi does, though. Then by book 3. Then by book 3, you really don't have a monster except for the brief appearance of Princess Langwidere. So it's worth acknowledging and worth talking about. Certainly, it's worth recognizing, but it really tapers off. And as you have that sort of villain tapering off and lessening in the series, you have the Nome King really taking over as the most prominent villain that just shows up over and over again, and much more overtly a patriarchal villain. So that's the main thing I want to talk about today. The Nome King as a patriarchal villain. So to recap the plot so far, Dorothy washes up on the shores of Ev. The kingdom of Ev, which is outside of Oz, is in the center of the continent of Non-Estica. Around Non-Estica, you have all these different countries. One of the countries is Ev, and under Ev, you have the caverns of the Nome King. The Nome King has a king under this underground kingdom. It spreads all over that area. The king of Ev sold his kids to the Nome King for immortality, but then the king of Ev jumped in the ocean. The king of Ev is another patriarchal character, like an evil patriarchal character, arguably a villainous patriarchal character, although he's dead before the story, so he doesn't really... his actions play a significant role in the story, but since he is dead before the story starts, he's not really a prominent villain in the story. My dog is going to chew something really loud, and I'm going to stop her. I'm shooting a video. Don't chew your chew toys. You're allowed chew toys while I'm shooting a video. It's very professional. She's just going to stare at me because I took her chew toy away. Bo doesn't chew loud things while I'm trying to shoot a video. She's a very quiet cat. Okay. I'm not getting distracted, I swear. So the king of Ev, certainly, if you're talking about patriarchal figures, you have plenty of characters to really point to just in the series as a whole. The wizard and Nome King being really the prominent ones. But you have some of the minor characters like the king of Ev, is patriarchal. I mean, patriarchal in a literal sense of that he's king, but the thing that is most often associated with patriarchs in Oz, a direct association with patriarchs in Oz, is objectification and materialism. One of the big themes to talk about in book 1 is materialism. Before the quarantine, I think I had a chance in one of my classes, at least, I had a chance to talk about materialism at least a little bit. But one of the things that makes the wizard really patriarchal in a lot of ways is he's really materialistic. There's an article by Zanita Fenton where she touches on this idea where the illusions of power are really enforced by materialism. So you have a character like the wizard who is tricking everyone, but the way he's tricking everyone is he's tricking them into thinking that the city's made out of emeralds. So it's very materialistic. Whereas you have the King of Ev who sells his kids to the Nome King. The Nome King turns them into toys, basically. So that's sort of a magical version of objectification, but really prominent in that image. And a really common sort of association with super patriarchal characters is that idea of objectification. And Gilbert and Gubar, Mad Woman in the Attic, Gilbert and Gubar talk about this a lot, the idea of the subject and the object, that the stereotypes that are reinforced by male writers are really designed for objectification of female characters or other, women in society, or whatever you want to call it, however you want to identify that dynamic. But it's for their objectification so that the male writers are turned into subjects. The subject has the ability to make choices. The subject has freedom. The subject has an identity. The object is really just there to be acted upon by the subject. So that dynamic, very, very important, just in feminist analysis generally, but it's definitely important in Ozma of Oz, the idea of objectification, where somebody having a choice, somebody being able to, move of his or her own will. And that shows up with TikTok. That shows up with, it shows up just constantly. Princess Langwidere using people as objects. It's not just the patriarchal characters. I was talking about this earlier today with someone. And Gilbert and Gubar talk about this too. They talk about how their book is called Mad Woman in the Attic because it's about Jane Eyre. The central image is from Jane Eyre, but they talk about how these patriarchal images of the objectification of women are internalized even in female writers. So you do have plenty of patriarchal characters like the Nome King who function by objectifying, turning, in his case, turning characters into objects, but function by objectification. But you have female characters who do that too. You have Princess Langwidere who cuts people's heads off and steals them and keeps them. But anyway, so to the Nome King, to not get too distracted. The Nome King. So the King of Ev sold his kids to the Nome King for immortality. Then the King of Ev jumped into the ocean. See if I can get it on both cameras as my dogs growl. I got it on both cameras, right? Let me see. Let me get a little closer. He jumped into the ocean. And so Ozma, Ozma and Dorothy are the ultra good characters and ultra heroic characters on every level. They have interesting complexities, but they're heroic and good and positive in pretty much every way. And so they go confront the Nome King, and they have lots of obstacles in getting there. Like Princess Langwidere is one of the obstacles. Both Ozma and Dorothy. I'm just jumping in really to the middle of this chapter, the Nome King chapter. I think that's chapter. No, what is this chapter? That's chapter 11. Something to avoid. Completely on another level. But in chapter 11, you kids out there might not know about chapter 11, bankruptcy. Speaking of materialism, both Ozma and Dorothy were much relieved to find the Nome King so jolly. So he starts off as this really charming guy. And it's sort of, there's definitely a character to compare the Nome King to constantly is the wizard. The wizard starts off as very frightening. They find out he's just a normal dude, and he comes off as jolly after that. Jolly is a good word. Jolly is a good word for the wizard afterwards. And the wizard, I mean, the key quote with the wizard is, I'm a good man, but a bad wizard. Arguably, he's not a good man either. That's a line definitely to analyze with the wizard. Why is he calling himself a good man? He's a con artist. But how is that possibly going to make him a good man? But he's a bad wizard and a bad man, arguably. But the Nome King comes off as jolly. Dorothy says he looks like Santa Claus. I mean, there's all this stuff where at first he seems really charming. Sit down, my dears. And a lot of the terminology he uses for Dorothy and Ozma, very belittling sort of terminology he uses. Sit down, my dears, said the king, and tell me why you have come all this way to see me and what I can do to make you happy. Here's a line. I mean, it's creepy on one level, certainly, but, knowing that he's really evil, I mean, even if you don't read it as a really creepy line, knowing that he's really evil, that's, and he turns people into objects and all that kind of stuff, it's got a lot of sinister subtext to it. While they seated themselves, the Nome King picked up a pipe, and taking a glowing red coal out of his pocket, he placed it in the bowl of the pipe and began puffing out clouds of smoke that curled in rings above his head. Dorothy thought this made the little monarch look more like Santa Claus than ever, but Ozma now began speaking, and everyone listened intently to her words. And so the whole pipe thing, speaking of sinister subtext, Dorothy is a very intelligent character, but she's also kind of naive sometimes. She's very trusting of everyone, and that's almost, arguably that's a big fault of hers, is that she's so trusting of everyone. So she sees this horrible guy smoking a pipe, and she says, he looks like Santa Claus. So very clever, practical, all these really positive things, but on the same time, so trustingly naive. That's sort of the paradox of Dorothy. She wants everyone to be good. Your Majesty, this is Ozma speaking. Your Majesty, said she, I am the ruler of the land of Oz, and I have come here to ask you to release the good Queen of Ebb and her 10 children, whom you have enchanted and hold as your prisoners. Oh, no, you are mistaken about that, replied the king. They are not my prisoners, but my slaves, whom I purchased from the King of Ebb. So very belittling in many ways. At this point, we still think he's kind of jolly. From our first impression, he seems kind of jolly, but knowing that he's this evil dude, has kind of sinister subtext. And he says, they're not my prisoners, but my slaves. He owns them. So, and that's a really interesting sort of distinction that he makes as well. Because the King of Ev sold his kids to the Nome King, and he points out, directly, they're not my prisoners, they're my slaves. I'm not keeping them as political prisoners. I own them. They're objects that belong to me. And one of the things about Matilda Jocelyn Gage, certainly a lot of feminist analysis is associated with the Oz series because of Baum's connection with Matilda Jocelyn Gage. But Matilda Jocelyn Gage, I'm saying her whole name, Gage, I guess, yeah, I could say it in short. Gage was also an abolitionist, and one of her big issues that she fought for was to unite first wave feminism with abolitionism, and she had a lot of resistance. There's a whole complicated argument that she went into about how feminism and abolitionism are united as movements. A lot of people pushed back on that idea. So intersectionality before that word existed. But I mean, so Baum makes a lot of references to slavery. And he was a little kid when the Civil War was going on. So he doesn't talk about remembering slavery existing. But he would have been alive when slavery existed. So he does reference slavery a lot. But Matilda Gage was, fought against slavery. So that image of slavery shows up a lot in the Oz series. And if you use that sort of historical filter of Matilda Gage to think about the Oz series, you certainly can notice how very frequently you have that sort of image of Gender equality mixed with gender inequality mixed with images of people being enslaved, different types of people throughout the different kingdoms of Non-Estica. And in this case, it's the royal family, but that image of slavery just comes up constantly in the Oz series. But that was wrong, said Ozma. And then the Nome King says, according to the laws of Ev, the king can do no wrong. So, I mean, a lot of that, you can certainly read that from the feminist perspective of him being the ultra patriarch, certainly. Who gets to decide the rules? The patriarch. What sort of rules does the patriarch decide? Things that benefit the patriarch. So that sort of cycle of self-fulfilling or, self-aggrandizement. But, great line for the patriarchy. According to the laws of Ev, the king can do no wrong. I mean, if you talk about it, a prime line for demonstrating the Nome King as the patriarch, there's a great line. And so that he had a perfect right to sell his family to me in exchange for a long life. So, if you look at anything the Nome King says, we certainly should react to that as wrong and evil. But he's very slick, and so you have to take a second to think about it. The laws of the land do say that he technically had a right to do that. Is he right or is he wrong? I mean, and certainly, that same sort of influence of abolitionism from Matilda Jocelyn Gage plays part there too. I mean, just because, there's the counter argument always to that argument. The counter argument was slavery was legal for decades and decades. Is something being legal make it right? Well, no, of course not. We can recognize that, but a lot of that sort of sophistry that the Nome King uses is just classically used by people in power, whether it's patriarchs, whoever else in power. So the King of Ev had a perfect right to sell his family to me in exchange for a long life. You cheated him, though, declared Dorothy, which, it's a little bit disappointing. It's not a great argument, Dorothy. However, I do understand why she says that. For the King of Ev did not have a long life. He jumped into the sea and was drowned. You can look at all kinds of examples of moral argumentation or philosophical argumentation going on there, and why Dorothy is not demonstrating the best argumentation. That was not my fault, because he easily refutes it. That was not my fault, said the Nome King, crossing his legs and smiling continually. I gave him the long life, all right, but he destroyed it. So the wrong thing to identify, if you go into moral argumentation, the deontologically wrong thing to identify is you don't own people. That's the key wrong that the Nome King is committing right there. Just because the Nome King cheated the King of Ev doesn't make either one of them right. So that's kind of the flaw in Dorothy. I love Dorothy. She's very smart. However, that's not her smartest moment. Then how could it be a long life? Easily enough. Now suppose, my dear, that I gave you a pretty doll. Here's where the patriarchy kicks in. This is one of my favorite lines for demonstrating the Nome King as ultra patriarchal character. The Nome King says, just to explain his con artistry, he says, suppose, my dear, or he throws my dear in constantly, says, suppose, my dear, that I gave you a pretty doll in exchange for a lock of your hair, and that after you had received the doll, you smashed it into pieces and destroyed it. Could you say that I had not given you a pretty doll? And so we know Dorothy. Dorothy doesn't have dolls. She's not really a typical girly girl. She grew up on a farm. Very, very patronizing. But yeah, if you talk about the Nome King as this patriarchal dude, that's a great line for that. On there, this is like the ultra Nome King as patriarch image right here. This is John R. Neal's illustration. He's this tiny guy, and he's just sitting here. There you go. Let me get it on both cameras. He's this tiny guy, and he's just sitting there on top of this big boulder, just to make himself feel like he's above everyone else. That's sort of what fuels the patriarchy, is the insecure need to feel above others. And it manifests as objectification, in many different ways in the story. But here it's manifesting physically in the space of the room. It's manifesting physically as him just having this ridiculous throne that's up above everyone else. And Dorothy and Ozma seem so much smaller, but we know from having read about them in 2 books before that they're very powerful characters. But he's just looking down on them. He's looking down on them in terms of the physical space, but he's also, looking down at them metaphorically. So if you broke this doll, this very patronizing, belittling sort of treatment of Dorothy, and you could, in fairness, ask me to return to you the lock of hair just because you had smashed the doll? No, said Dorothy again. Of course not, the Nome King returned. Nor will I give up the queen and her children because the king of Ev destroyed his long life by jumping into the sea. They belong to me, and I shall keep them. But you are treating them cruelly, said Ozma, who was much distressed by the king's refusal. In what way? He asked. By making them your slaves, said she. Now we're getting into the actual. Immorality of the situation. Cruelty, remarked the monarch, puffing out wreaths of smoke and watching them float into the air, is a thing I can't abide. So he's very slick. He's very, he uses a lot of sophistry. He uses a lot of sort of, it's textbook sort of manipulative language. But so he has, the clear immorality of the situation is that he's enslaved this family. The king of Ev really had no right to sell his family. He has no right to own the king of Ev's family. But he's trying to self-justify this horrible act. And one of the arguments that he's making is that he's not treating them cruelly. Ultimately, cruelty is a secondary evil of owning people. So it's fallacy sort of related to the straw man fallacy, not exactly, but it's looking at what is certainly an evil in the act, which is the cruelty, and ignoring the overarching evil, which is it's wrong to own people. So, this sort of textbook manipulative, fallacious argumentation right there. Cruelty is the thing I can't abide. So he's elevating himself. He views himself as being heroic. That's something I always keep in mind with patriarchs. Patriarchs view themselves as being benevolent and heroic. They don't view themselves as being evil. We could certainly view the Nome King as evil, but he's not viewing himself as evil. He's certainly not presenting himself as evil. It's sort of like with the wizard saying, I'm a good man, but a bad wizard. He may believe that, but we could see from the outside perspective, is he really a good man? No, he's not. Arguably, no, he's not. As slaves must work hard, and the Queen of Ev and her children were delicate and tender, I transformed them all into articles of ornament and bric-a-brac. That's a tongue twister. Ornament and bric-a-brac. And scatter them around the various rooms of my palace instead of being obliged to labor. They merely decorate my apartment, and I really think I have treated them with great kindness. So he's self-justifying his objectification by saying, I objectified them. I turned them into actual objects, but I don't treat them cruelly. I don't make them work. Therefore, I must be okay. Well, it's still a deeply immoral act that he's committing. But what a dreadful fate is theirs, exclaimed Ozma earnestly. And the kingdom of Ev is in great need of its royal family to govern it. If you will liberate them and restore them to their proper forms, I will give you 10 ornaments to replace each one you lose. There's all kinds of complicated things going on. So, the obvious evil is certainly objectification, turning them into objects. That's indefensible. But how should Ozma really respond? She's clearly a good character. She has great intention. She's a very moral character. But what's really the right moral answer there? If somebody has enslaved this royal family and turned them into objects, Ozma is essentially bribing them. So is it right for her to bribe them? It's not an easy answer. It's easy to recognize that what the Nome King is doing is wrong, but I hope, I don't know. Fingers crossed. I hope it's easy to recognize for most people. You never know. But it's not easy to say what to do about it. I mean, just even the idea. I mean, one of the really complicated ideas in this book, it's a kid's book, but it has a lot of really complicated ideas. One of the complicated ideas is that Oz and Ev are two different kingdoms, and the Nome Kingdom is a different kingdom. Does Ozma, as the ruler of Oz, have the right to tell the Nome King, as the ruler of the Nome Kingdom, that what he's doing is wrong? It's not an easy question to answer. It's a complicated moral question to answer. And even, beyond that really basic question, you have, how does she actually solve it? Does she commit an act of violence? That's a big part of book 6, actually, is, how do you fight against evil people who want to destroy you? Do you commit acts of violence? Complicated question. Ozma says no. I mean, that's, spoiler alert for book 6, but Ozma says no, never commit an act of violence. Do you bribe an evil person? Do you give an evil person treasure in order to free these objectified people? It's not an easy question, for sure. Suppose I refuse, he asked. Then said Ozma firmly, I am here with my friends and my army to conquer your kingdom and oblige you to obey my wishes. What does conquer mean for Ozma? She's a pacifist. It's a cool line. Ozma's a very powerful character. Very positive, very powerful, very, very powerful ruler. So it's a cool line to say, I'm here to conquer you. But she's also a pacifist. So what does conquer mean for a pacifist? It's very complicated. The Nome King laughed until he choked, so very patronizing, just constantly. And he choked until he coughed, and he coughed until his face turned from grayish brown to bright red. Then he wiped his eyes with a rock-colored handkerchief and grew grave again. You are as brave as you are pretty, my dear. Very patronizing. If you talk about ultra patriarch, you are as brave as you are pretty. Good Lord. But you have little idea of the extent of the task you have undertaken. Come with me for a moment. He arose and took Ozma's hand, leading her to a little door at one side of the room. He opened, and they stepped out upon a balcony from whence they obtained a wonderful view of the underground world. A vast cave extended for miles and miles under the mountain. In every direction were furnaces and forges, glowing brightly, and gnomes hammering upon precious metals or polishing gleaming jewels all around the walls. With thousands of doors of silver and gold built into the solid rock, and these extended in rows far away into the distance, as far as Ozma's eyes could follow them. While the little maid from Oz gazed wonderingly upon this scene, the Nome King uttered a shrill whistle, and at once all the silver and gold doors flew open. Solid ranks of gnome soldiers. Well, anyway, it's a lot of description, but it's just, he's got this big army. Boom, that's good description. I like his description, but it's just, it goes on and on. This is but a small part of my army. No ruler upon earth has ever dared to fight me, and no ruler ever will, for I am too powerful to oppose. So, he's a patriarch. He's this very patriarchal character. So he associates value with physical might and the might of an army. Super patriarchal sort of position to take. That, hold on, I'm doing something. Can you wait a minute? I'm gonna come up here and say hi. both dogs at the same time. Hey guys, okay. Can you wait for me to get done before you start barking at me? I can't do a video at all without one of these crazies barking at me. Hey Jenny, what's up? I have dogs eating my face right now. So anyway, hush. Are you done? Okay. Just quiet. Happy Easter. Say happy Easter. Say happy Easter. Say happy Easter. Now you're not going to talk. Okay. He said happy Easter. He said happy Easter. Okay. It'd be foolish of us to fight, the girl said to the Tin Woodman. For our brave 27 would be quickly destroyed. I'm sure I do not know how to act in this emergency. So again, it's what can she do? That's a complicated question. She recognizes right and wrong pretty easily. But what is the solution? That's a lot harder question to ask. It's a lot harder question to answer, I should say. Ask his king where the kitchen is, said the tiger. I'm hungry as a bear. I might pounce upon the king and tear him in pieces. The Cowardly Lion is actually a very violent character in the books. Try it, said the monarch, lighting his pipe. Very patronizing even to the lion. The lion crouched low and tried to spring. No. It seems to me, said the scarecrow thoughtfully, that our best plan is to wheedle his majesty into giving us his slaves, since he is too great a magician to oppose. This is the most sensible thing if any of you have suggested, declared the Gnome King. It is folly to threaten me, but I'm so kind-hearted. Again, he's constantly upping himself in value, praising himself, that I cannot stand coaxing or wheedling. If you really wish to accomplish anything by your journey, my dear Ozma, you must coax me. Just very, very patronizing. You can convince me by begging me. He's like the most loathsome of all Oz characters. He's so slimy. Where was I? Let us be friends and talk this over in a friendly manner. He's so slimy and he always says these seemingly kind things. He's just the worst. To be sure, agreed the king, his eyes twinkling merrily. I'm very anxious, she continued, to liberate the Queen of Ebb and her children, who are now ornaments and bric-a-brac in your majesty's palace, and to restore them to their people. Tell me, sir, how this may be accomplished. The king remained thoughtful for a moment, after which he asked, are you willing to take a few chances and risks yourself in order to set free the people of Ebb? Yes, indeed, answered Ozma eagerly. Then, said the Gnome King, I will make you this offer. You shall go alone and unattended into the palace and examine carefully all that the rooms contain. Then you shall have permission to touch 11 different objects. Hush. 11 different objects. Pronouncing at the time of the word Ev, and if any of them, or more than one, proves to be the transformation of the Queen of Ev, or any of her 10 children, then they will instantly be restored to their true forms and may leave my palace and my kingdom in your company without any objection whatever. It is possible for you in this way to free the entire 11. If you do not guess all the objects correctly and some of the slaves remain transformed, then each one of your friends and followers may in turn enter the palace and have the same privileges I grant you. Oh, thank you for this kind offer. So it's a contest. He's just setting up this contest. So they touch the objects in order to free the king of Ev, or the Queen of Ev, the kingdom of Ev, the royal family of Ev. And spoiler alert. I'm going to wrap it up, but spoiler alert, they mostly fail. They get really, really, really close to everyone completely failing. But when they fail, Ozma turns into an object. Everybody turns into an object. So it's this image of characters turning into objects, turning into little toys or whatever, just over and over and over again. But that's sort of the Gnome King's thematic image, is turning characters into objects and owning them. And sort of in this slimy, manipulative way, making them seem like they have a choice, but there is actually no choice, and just tricking them, and manipulating them into the situation where he owns everyone, which is horrible. But though, just one note, this is sort of a spoiler. This is definitely a spoiler for the end. But the character who ends up defeating him is Belina, the chicken, because he's allergic to eggs. So the symbolism of the egg is this very feminine image. So, and I don't think that's accidental that this super patriarchal character who's objectifying everyone is defeated by a chicken who is objectified as food. And the thing she's able to produce that is this, ultimate feminine image. I don't think any of that is really accidental. But that's really the main plot. I mean, that's sort of the unusual thing about this book, is that the main plot really starts in the middle and gets wrapped up. I mean, it's a fairly consistent sort of plot. They have this contest where they have to find what the royal family of Ev is turned into. Most of them get turned into objects themselves. So you have that repeated image of objectification. And then the culmination of that is Belina being the secret to defeating this ultra patriarchal character with eggs. I mean, it's ridiculous, but if you look at how the Nome King parallels all of these basic manifestations of patriarchy, there's so many different manifestations of patriarchy. The way he talks, the way he treats others as objects, the way he turns others into objects. All that sort of stuff. We just started the series. Series is amazing. All 14. I love all 14 books. I spoiled a little bit of Ozma of Oz there for you. I mean, but it's a great series. So it's still tons of fun. I mean, that's the thing. It has really, really serious themes of how patriarchs manipulate and objectify people. That's a very serious theme, but it does it in kind of a ridiculous way. I mean, it's a whole idea of a patriarch objectifying people, very serious, very significant thing to recognize as a central theme, but he's defeated by eggs. I mean, it's really absurd and silly. So it's a very serious topic presented in this very fun way. But I will wrap it up for today. That's episode 10. That's really the rest of the main plot. It's kind of consistent, so I don't know. I don't know if there's all that much more to say about the rest of the series, but we'll see. If I could get my son to listen to the rest of the series, I'll just read it to him. But I'll see you on the next Ozma of Oz. Deep Dive episode 11.